Okay, welcome everybody to today's episode of the IDDF podcast, which stands for the Israel Defense and Diplomacy Forum. That's where we get the IDDF acronym from. And I'm very pleased to be hosted by Professor Chuck Freilich, a former Deputy National Security Advisor here in the State of Israel. He's also a professor at Columbia University in New York and Tel Aviv University here in the State of Israel, and an erstwhile long-standing member at the Belfer Center at Harvard University. Chuck, thank you very much for having me back for another episode.
It is great to have you. I sung your praises last time. I should probably say some of them again today after that introduction. But for those who don't know, Benjamin is the co-chair of the Miryam Center together with Rosita Pnimi, a think tank that does a lot of very good work, both in terms of research, as think tanks always do, bringing delegations of military cadets from West Point and other American military academies to Israel, and a former combat soldier in the IDF, and a doer of many good deeds.
Thank you very much, Chuck. I appreciate the high praise, and thank you for being here. And we're delighted at the Miryam Institute to have this program, because what it does is it enables us to spar a little bit and discuss some hot topics that we've got here in Israel. We're going to curtail this program to about 55, maybe 57 minutes or so. We're going to zone in on three topics today. The first is the mooted potential normalization between the Saudi Arabian Kingdom and the State of Israel, brokered, of course, by the United States of America, if it comes to pass. The second topic that we're going to come to is the crisis or non-crisis, depending on how one looks at it, between the State of Israel and its most important strategic ally, the United States of America. And the third topic that we're going to get into, if we have time, is the threat that seems to be growing somewhat on our northern border, specifically our border with Lebanon, specifically the raising of tensions between the IDF and Hezbollah, the terrorist organization sponsored by Iran that is ensconced there in southern Lebanon. So those are the three topics, and I'm going to ask you to take the lead, if you would, by delving into topic number one, which is normalization.
It's Saudi-Israeli normalization, but really we're talking a multilateral, a quadrilateral package that the U.S. is considering. President Biden gave, I presume that many of our listeners are readers of the New York Times and have read Thomas Friedman's slew of recent articles about Israel, including the last two, which had to do with an hour-and-a-quarter interview that President Biden gave him. And the second half of the interview, very surprisingly, was about the possible normalization deal. Not by chance, I believe it was released a day after the Knesset passed the so-called the reasonability clause. This may have been an indirect American answer, an expression partly of American frustration with where Israel's heading. But in any event, it's a very, very ambitious program that the president muted there. He himself has said he's not yet sure that he's willing to really invest in it, but he did send his national security advisor and top Mideast guy the day after the interview to Riyadh to explore it, and there are ongoing contacts. And the idea is the following. First of all, the Saudis agreed to normalize relations with Israel. For Israel, a tremendous breakthrough. In exchange, the Saudis have a number of demands, all of which are actually directed towards the U.S., not Israel. First of all, they want a defense treaty with the United States. That's a tall order. Secondly, as part of the defense treaty, certainly as an extension of it, they would want essentially unlimited access to the most advanced American conventional weapons. They would want the U.S. to agree to a civil Saudi nuclear program. What that really means from our point of view is the ability to enrich uranium on Saudi territory. We'll come back to that in a minute. That's an important demand. Now, in exchange for potentially, I stress the word potentially, agreeing to this, the U.S. will want the Saudis to finally put an end to the war in Yemen and limit their ties with China, which have been expanding recently. And people may remember the recent Saudi-Iranian rapprochement, which was brokered by the Chinese. And the Saudis would be asked to provide generous, very generous economic aid to the Palestinian Authority. All of this, of course, in exchange for normalization with Israel. The country that, or the part of this quadrilateral package that would have to make the biggest concessions is Israel, because Israel would be asked to put an end to any measures that might endanger a future two-state solution. And what this means in more concrete terms would be an agreement indefinitely to refrain from annexation of the West Bank, from building further settlements, from legalizing the illegal or the informal outposts, and also to agree to transfer some territory from Area C, the part of the West Bank that is under full Israeli control today, to transfer that to the Palestinians. The Palestinians, or specifically the Palestinian Authority, would be asked to give its blessing to this package, to not try and stand in the way of it. And in exchange, they would get the extensive Saudi aid, and they would indirectly get the Israeli commitment to refrain from these various moves in the West Bank. These would be historic Israeli concessions that are of importance to them. The U.S. itself would have to make very important concessions here, offer the Saudis very important inducements. We'll talk about them in 1 second. But I think what the president is trying to do is he's trying actually to confront the Saudis, Israel, especially Israel, with the need to make historic concessions. He understands just how far-reaching this is for Israel. Obviously, he's not a disinterested party. There are American strategic interests involved. There are American political Mr. Biden's own political interests involved. Fundamentally, I think, though, this is really a case, the president is a lifelong friend of Israel's. He's a man who defines himself as a Zionist. And I think he views this as an opportunity. You can agree with him, of course, or disagree. But from his perspective, I believe he sincerely believes that he would be saving Israel from itself, both in terms of the future of the West Bank, the Palestinian issue, and in terms of the judicial reform process in Israel. As I said, it's still unclear if the president believes that the conditions are there for going forward. And here, let me hand it over to you for your initial response, and we'll play some ping pong here about what we think of this.
So this should be a good rally if we get into the ping pong. But before I lob this back over to your side, let me ask you a question, a very basic question, more for the benefit of our listeners through your lens and your particular perspective of expertise. Is there virtue in discussing this, Chuck? Is this not just in the area of rumor and innuendo and suggestion right now? Why do we have to address ourselves, in your opinion, to Saudi-Israel normalization? It hasn't yet come to the boil by any stretch of the imagination. Are we delving into this too soon? Just talk to us about that, if you would.
Well, it's been on the agenda for a number of years now, and the Saudis have wavered at times. Sometimes they put more emphasis on the Palestinian issue, sometimes less. Basically, I think as long as the king is still alive, until the crown prince, the de facto ruler, Mohammed bin Salman, known as MBS, until he succeeds the king, certainly, the Saudis cannot go ahead without major movement on the Palestinian issue. It doesn't have to be a final peace agreement, but they need something substantial. After MBS takes over, maybe the Saudis can fudge that issue more. They can never abandon it completely, but compromise more. So it's been with us for a number of years. For Israel, I think it would be a historic transformation in the entire situation. in the Middle East and beyond. Remember, Saudi Arabia isn't just the keeper of the two holy places, Mecca and Medina, the heart of the entire Muslim world, Sunni or Shia. It opens up, in essence, normalization, peace with the Palestinians, puts an end to the Arab-Israeli conflict. It doesn't put an end to the conflict with Iran or Hezbollah or Hamas, but with the Arab states, it pretty much puts an end to it. And it opens up the possibility of normalization with countries such as Indonesia, Malaysia, Pakistan. Those are hundreds of millions of people. I don't think that the president would have mooted this with Friedman, and it's clear that this is something that he's giving serious thought to if he wasn't serious about it. If he didn't want to pursue this, and he sent Sullivan, the national security advisor, and McGurk, the Mideast guy, the next day for talks, and there have been talks since then. So when you say, is this serious? Is it just political palaver? I think it's serious enough that the president is weighing it, and I hope he succeeds.
So I thank you for answering that. I just wanted everybody to understand the context of this discussion and this conversation and why it's worthy of us delving into a little bit. And as you might expect, I disagree with the virtue of this plan as it currently is. And I want to outline a few points, if I may. First of all, I disagree with the idea that all of the requirements come from the side of the Americans. There are heavy requirements placed before the Israelis for normalization with the Saudis, even at this current stage, which is the stage of rumor and, as I said, innuendo and supposition, with a little bit more to it than just that. I don't want to downplay it. I do agree with your assessment that there seems to be something that's gaining momentum, but the president himself, President Biden, has said there's still a great deal to talk about, and they are not even close to the finish line. But even at this early stage, heavy concessions are being required and expressed with regard to what Israel must sacrifice. And those include the following. I don't believe that the requirement is for an indefinite freezing of applying sovereignty over Judea and Samaria. I think that the requirement is for a permanent end to any plans, which is distinct from indefinite, a permanent end to any plans. To any plans to apply sovereignty over Judea and Samaria. So I don't think it's a requirement for an indefinite pause. I think it's a requirement for a permanent end to such plans, which is distinct. The other thing is that I read with great interest your own article, which I would encourage others to read, that you co-authored with some of your fellows over there at the INSS. And the rubric, the overall picture of the article, the abstract of the article said that, and I'm quoting here, possible normalization between Israel and Saudi Arabia has returned to the headlines in light of President Biden's public reference to the initiative and reports of behind-the-scenes efforts to advance an agreement. And then you pose the question, how close are we to the day when an Israeli prime minister will walk in Riyadh in public? Which is a very, very interesting question. But I want to pose a different question, Chuck. I want to ask, how close are we to the day when a Palestinian president will walk in Jerusalem as president of a Palestinian state with East Jerusalem as its capital? And how close are we to a day when an Israeli prime minister is no longer able to walk in various parts of Jerusalem, which is the eternal capital of the Jewish people and the Jewish peoplehood, because it's been bargained away in the pursuit of normalization? You know, to give a little bit more context to that, the Trump Peace to Prosperity plan that was released during the previous administration, of course, was a plan, Chuck, that masqueraded and that was mischaracterized as the most pro-Israel peace plan of any American government. But within that plan, it called for a state for the Palestinian Arabs in Judea and Samaria, a capital of that state in East Jerusalem called Al-Quds, land concessions from the state of Israel, including in undisputed areas of the country, particularly within the Padran Desert down in the south of the country. And it also suggested the virtue of Jews who are in various parts of Judea and Samaria now living beneath the flag of a Palestinian state in the event that some sort of an agreement was to come to fruition. Now, I see similar standards being preserved here by the United States of America when it comes to normalization with the Saudis. There is an open suggestion that the States of Israel, as you just said, preserves the conditions for a two-state solution, which, as I have said many, many times, is an idea that I think must be cast into the dustbin of history, because I believe it to be nonsense, impracticable, and unimplementable, and quite frankly, just a wrong-headed idea. And even more egregious than that is this suggestion now that Area C, and for our listeners to understand, Area C is the area in Judea and Samaria, which under the Oslo Accords, the Israelis have complete control over, security responsibility, and our presence in Judea and Samaria is largely concentrated in Area C, that from Area C, Israel will have to start to make some sort of withdrawal. So here's my take on this idea of normalization. If the American quid is that it brings to the table normalization between Israel and the Saudis, but Israel's quo is that it has to preserve the possibility of land concessions and the partition of Jerusalem, I say no to normalization. I don't think that it is a greater privilege for an Israeli prime minister to walk out in the open in Riyadh than it is for an Israeli prime minister to be a prime minister of the State of Israel with an undivided capital, Jerusalem, at its heart.
Okay, I think you have stated your position very clearly and cogently. And before I respond to that, let me just step back for 1 second. Because you already went to the consequences, assuming that this happens, and a great deal has to happen before. There are a number of other critical ramifications other than the future of the West Bank and the Palestinian issue. So let me just briefly touch on that, and then I'll respond to what you said. So one of the Saudi conditions, as we've both mentioned, is a defense treaty with the U.S. The United States hasn't given any country a defense treaty since Japan in 1961. So it's about 62 years since the last time. That was at the height of the Cold War. It was Japan. The last time a non-democratic country got it was South Korea at the time. Today it is a democracy, but 1953. The U.S. doesn't give security guarantees easily, because a security guarantee means that an attack on some other country is the equivalent of an attack on the United States. So it takes it very, very, very seriously. Are they now going to give a security guarantee to a country that that President Biden just called a pariah state a couple of years ago during the campaign? He's not using that rhetoric now because he's president, but I don't think he really feels any differently about it. The Democratic Party doesn't feel differently about it. I think it's clear to the president that if the U.S. grants a security treaty to the Saudis, there's going to be a line of Middle Eastern states after that who will want defense treaties also, possibly first and foremost Israel, but the UAE, Egypt, and others. If, by the way, this happens, and if there are a number of defense treaties, well, that could be the basis for a very strong regional defense architecture that a number of American administrations have spoken about. The second thing, and here there are deep American and Israeli concerns involved. So the Saudis want agreement for a civil nuclear program of their own, without committing, as the UAE did a few years ago, to what's called the gold standard, the 1, 2, 3 clause. In other words, no enrichment in their territory. That's where you start getting concerned about proliferation ramifications. We don't care, we, the US or Israel, don't care if the Saudis have a real civil nuclear program. What we're concerned about, of course, is the things that could enable them down the line, as Iran did and Iraq did, Libya, Syria, to do the bad things, to proliferate militarily. That would be a very tough decision. And by the way, my support for this whole package would be contingent on the U.S. having, if it's not this so-called 1, 2, 3 clause, then there's got to be some other mechanism in place to ensure that the Saudis cannot do bad things. And it's got to be, in essence, in perpetuity.
And by those other things, you're referring to inspections, I assume, to
has to be an
inspections.
Right. There has to be some sort of inspections regime, some mechanism so that the U.S. is there permanently to make sure that nothing bad is happening. And of course, that's not easy for the Saudis. It's their sovereign territory.
It's also not easy for the US to enforce. Of course, there's also always the possibility that inspectors are booted out of the area they're supposed to be inspecting.
Yeah, but you're absolutely right, and that's one of the problems. If they're booted out, of course, then all the alarm bells go off, and you know you're in a crisis. They can't go nuclear overnight if the inspectors have really been there effectively till then. And the other thing, and again, this raises all sorts of concerns in the U.S. and Israel, is if the Saudis want, as part of the defense treaty, what would probably be their right, which is access to essentially every conventional American weapon, well, how does the U.S. continue to preserve Israel's qualitative military edge, which the U.S. is committed to by legislation, congressional legislation? This will probably lead to a arms race in the region, which we will be very, very hard-pressed to keep up with. The Saudis and others can finance it more easily than we can, even with American military aid. The good news here is, of course, if this happens, and I stress again and again, it's still a big if, Iran is the big loser here. The rapprochement with Saudi Arabia is essentially off, or at least set back considerably. They start feeling themselves very severely surrounded by American very close allies or treaty allies. And of course, it helps the US push the Chinese and the Russians back out of the region. So that's the good news here. But then to come back to the point that you made, unless you want to say something first.
Just some points that we actually touched upon in our previous conversation about this, which is security guarantees or a military pact, whatever one wants to term them. So I view askance those notions at the best of times. For our listeners, there's an idea that obviously within NATO, within the NATO Charter, Article 5 specifically, there is an idea that attack upon one member of NATO is akin to an attack upon all members of NATO, including the United States of America, and therefore all members of NATO are expected to respond in kind. Now, in kind is a very, very broad phrase. If one reads Article 5 of NATO, it covers all manners of responses to military aggression against a state, from perhaps the supply of non-military humanitarian aid all the way up to hardware and even boots on the ground. All of that, and each country will select where they click in within that spectrum. But the idea that we have here, given that we're not a NATO country and that Saudi is not a NATO country, is that we would enjoy something akin to Article 5. And I want to ask you, can you think of a time where the United States has actually acted in accordance with Article 5 of late with regard to the state of Israel or anybody else outside of NATO or indeed inside NATO? Talk to us about that.
Well, first of all, there are 50 countries, not just NATO, which is 28, that the U.S. has given security guarantees to over the years. Japan, Australia, New Zealand are not NATO members. All of these 50, and really the formal defense treaties are the NATO 28 and another 3 or 4. It's not just responding in kind. There is a commitment to hold consultations regarding the means of addressing the threat to their shared national security. Now, all of these countries have been willing to base their national security on those ambiguous words. It's hard to define these types of things, to find the perfect language, but there is also some sort of intentional ambiguity here. Look, the United States has based its entire post-World War II strategy on a series of alliances with countries around the world. This has been tested during the Cold War. The U.S. lived up to its commitments during the Cold War. There was always the question, a very good question that you're posing, well, okay, if it comes to the crunch, will the U.S. really do it? Right? If the Soviets at the time had dropped a bomb on, not even dropped a bomb. If they had invaded and conquered West Berlin, was the U.S. going to risk American cities to push them out of West Berlin? Good question. Most American experts say yes, because otherwise there's no credibility whatsoever to anything we ever say. It's got to really be an absolute commitment. And to make things worse, in some cases, the U.S. added tripwires. Even a symbolic deployment, sometimes not symbolic, but even a symbolic deployment of American troops to further deter the Soviets, to say, oh, if you guys kill a few of our soldiers, that's enough. Already we'll get a response. If you're looking for perfect security in life, first of all, it doesn't exist. And second of all, you're ensuring perfect insecurity for yourself and for your allies, for your adversaries. So I don't think we can look for perfection here. I think the U.S. will live up to its commitments. And you asked, has it ever done so in Israel's case? Of course. What do you call the massive airlift during the Yom Kippur War, the massive resupply after the war, a strategic alliance that's been going for the last 50 years, in which the U.S. has given Israel really remarkable aid in a whole variety of areas? Would I base Israel's future security just on that? No. That's why we have the IDF, and in the end, we rely on ourselves. But,
so I think for the points that you made earlier about this, I think that a very, very positive aspect of this would be that Iran potentially ends up being the loser. I think it would be very, very positive if this resulted in driving a wedge between the Saudis and the Iranians, particularly given the rapprochement. I think it would be wonderful to push China a little bit onto the back foot, seeing as it's meddling in Middle Eastern matters. Of course, that may be what actually has brought the United States to the position where they're saying we need to get more engaged, re-engage and intensify engagement. All of that's very, very positive. Now, you may say, Benjamin, this renders you a non-strategic thinker. Fine. But I think that in order to bring about all of those positive outcomes, there is enough inducement without having the ceding or the preservation of the idea of ceding land in Judea and Samaria by the state of Israel and the potential partitioning of Jerusalem as our capital city here in Israel, in order to bring the Saudis to the table and to get them to do this deal. I actually wonder what on earth that has to do with anything, quite frankly, particularly given the fact that if you read through the various price list that is placed before the parties to this normalization, so the Saudis, the Israelis, and the Palestinian Arabs, one can see that, surprise, surprise, absolutely nothing is expected from the Palestinian Arabs, other than for them to say, we bless this initiative, which is really not much at all. So I'd be happy to hear what you have to say about that. And incidentally, I spoke in the previous episode about where I think the shortcomings were of the airlift to Israel in the Yom Kippur War that you just referenced, and where the shortcomings were to the notion of resupply, particularly under the Obama administration. People can go back and listen to that and make up their own minds. But talk to me about what I've just said.
Look, the Palestinians are basically ignored for a second time here. They were ignored with the UAE normalization. They're basically ignored here. from their perspective and from the perspective of their supporters, they're being asked to swallow something very big once again. From my point of view, that's a price I'm willing to pay happily if we can get normalization with the Saudis. But this deal does nothing to address the Palestinian issue, at least in terms of reaching a solution. From your perspective, it very much addresses it in a negative way. And here there's a fundamental difference. Do you believe that this is Judea and Samaria, our national birthright? And I don't deny that it's Judea and Samaria. And as I've said in previous podcasts, that's where the biblical story takes place. And if you're a Zionist and believe in Israel's rebirth, I mean, that's where it happened. But we live in 2023, not a couple of thousand years ago. And for you, this is, of course, a threat because it means maybe your formulation was more correct, not indefinite postponement, but perpetual abandonment of the intention to annex. From my perspective, that's, of course, a very good thing. Maybe it's an Israeli concession, but it's something that we should want to do. Not tomorrow out of the blue, but of course in the context of a peace agreement, where from my point of view, unilaterally, in exchange for security measures, which will never be 100% effective, where the situation isn't 100% wonderful today either. The security situation in the West Bank is quite bad the last year and a half. I think anything that helps us end the de facto annexation, because that's where we're heading, especially under this government, anything that puts off the point of no return where we can never reach a future two-state solution. And by the way, I do share your skepticism whether it is practical, whether it can be done. I do think it's the desirable outcome, maybe it's not my dream outcome, but it's the desirable one given realities. I tend to think we're going to have to withdraw unilaterally from most of the West Bank, again, for security guarantees, and say to the Palestinians, if you ever want to get even more, well, for that, we're going to need a negotiated agreement. To me, getting out of the West Bank is an objective because of the threat to Israel's fundamental character as a Jewish and democratic state. And for you, of course, it's a different kind of a threat.
So I think with regards to that, and we have to get to our other two topics, so I just want to make a couple of quick points, and then we can pivot, if you like, to the joyous, I say that sarcastically, subject of a crisis in relations between Israel and the United States of America. But just prior to that, I think that in order to preserve Israel's democratic and Jewish character, Israel has to remain in the birthplace of Judaism, which is Judea and Samaria. It's not Tel Aviv. It's Judea and Samaria. I think that we have to be there. We should be there. We're right to be there. And I think that it would actually decrease our security to withdraw from that area. We would lose the very, very minuscule amounts of strategic depth that we currently have. We would cede the topographical advantage to the Palestinian Arabs, who are not a group of people who have shown great form when it comes to making peace with Israel, and I say that in the most euphemistic manner possible. Understood. And I also would say that it's an interesting gambit here by those proponents of the two-state solution, because I think by asking the Palestinian Authority to bless normalization between Israel and the Saudis, I actually think that the Palestinian Authority would lose the Palestinian Arab street and further push away the prospect of them being able to enter into a two-state reality, even if one comes about as a realistic presentation and opportunity. I think that everybody needs to consider that. I don't think that it's necessarily considered sufficiently. And for that reason, by the way, I don't think that the Palestinian Authority will rise to the expectation that they give their blessing to Saudi-Israel normalization, because I think that they know that that's really ringing their own death knell. when it comes to continuing control. So those are some of the thoughts that I have about this. I will just say, I want to make it really, really clear in case it's not. I do not believe that there is any inducement sufficiently attractive to justify the state of Israel and the people of Israel withdrawing from specifically Judea and Samaria, specifically any part of Jerusalem. I think it's counter-strategic, and I think that doing so gives one very clear message to the international community and to our neighbors and regional partners and opponents, which is, if we are willing to withdraw from there, we are actually willing to withdraw from anywhere, and nothing is sacred to us. And I find it preposterous that the Saudis would be able to say, in order to get weapons, conventional weapons, a civilian nuclear program, and so forth, all that has to happen is the state of Israel has to carve up its own metaphoric heart and give half of it away to its mortal enemies, as they define themselves, the Palestinian Arabs. So that's where I am on it. But on that note, let's turn a little bit now, Chuck, to the crisis between Israel and the United States of America. You've mentioned to me that you view it as perhaps existential. Why do you take it to that length?
Look, I think one way or the other, we will eventually be forced kicking and screaming to reach a resolution of the Palestinian issue. Agreed. Okay. I think it should be done to the extent possible out of our own volition, because then the chances of getting a better deal are increased. I think one way or the other, we will handle the Iranian threat. We will do what has to be done to hopefully prevent them from going nuclear. And if we're unable to do that, the state of Israel is a very powerful country with all sorts of capabilities, and we can live much less securely, but we can live with a nuclear Iran and get through that as well. The one thing I don't know that we can do, certainly for the coming decades, is live well, possibly even survive without the United States. And we've talked in previous podcasts, I don't want to belabor it again, all the ways in which the U.S. is absolutely critical to Israel's security. And I'm not talking just about the $4 billion in annual aid. It goes way beyond that. There is a serious question. We can talk about this at greater length in another podcast. When I say why Israel may not be able to survive with the U.S., why I'm saying something that far-reaching. We need the U.S. for the Palestinian issue, for the Iranian issue, for normalization, for everything that we do, pretty much. We need the U.S. Half the Jewish people live in the United States. Okay, so we've also talked, I believe we may have discussed in the last podcast, and certainly in the previous ones with Danny Ayalon, we've talked repeatedly about the emerging crisis with the U.S. And I don't want to belabor, again, all the topics, the causes of this crisis. I will mention what I have said in the past. In 2020, during the presidential campaign, 3 leading Democratic candidates, Senator Warren, Senator Sanders, and today, Secretary of Transportation at the time, Congressman Buttigieg, all said publicly.
Mayor Buttigieg. Mayor Buttigieg.
Mayor.
South.
I stand corrected.
South Bend.
Yes, South Bend, correct.
Yeah.
For the first time ever, publicly, as part of the campaign, spoke in favor of making military aid to Israel contingent on a change in its Palestinian policies. The one thing that was always sacred in the U.S.-Israeli relationship was military aid. You could disagree about everything else. That was sacred. Well, it was the 3 of them at the time. I said at the time, once they've broken the taboo, this is increasingly going to find its way into the mainstream. It won't happen overnight. It's still not the mainstream discussion among Democrats, but it's just about there. And let me give you a few examples. And by the way, not just Democrats. New York Times columnist Nicholas Kristof comes out a week or so with a column calling for, saying, well, maybe it's time to end aid to Israel. Two former American ambassadors to the United States, Democrats, Dan Kurtzer, an Orthodox Jew, and Martin Indyk, also Jewish, guys who spent many years in the administration. Kurtzer was a career foreign service official. Indyk served under multiple administrations. Mideast experts, as I said, ambassadors to Israel, said, this is horrible. Israel no longer shares U.S. values. Israel rejects American policy regarding the West Bank. It's a well-to-do, strong, straight time to end aid. Max Boot, also Jewish, conservative Republican correspondent for the Washington Post, says, by the way, born in the former Soviet Union, his family considered immigrating to Israel. They wound up in the U.S. Israel is no longer the country he loves. It has become, not as becoming, an illiberal democracy, the Hungary of the Middle East. Time to start ending aid. David Rothkopf, a well-regarded columnist, pundit, close to the Biden administration, says the same thing. I don't think it's going to be there big time in the 2024 elections, but it will be there. It's part of becoming Democratic and even Republican discourse. And if not in 2024, in the coming years, it will be. And Israel can, if it has to, can afford to lose the financial aid. Okay, if we had to, we could tighten our belts and buy the weapons. We can't afford to risk the overall relationship with the U.S., and I think we're heading towards a cliff.
Okay, you've said a lot there, and I appreciate you saying a lot, and I'm trying to be mindful of our time here. So let me go through things almost in a shopping list fashion. The first, Iran. So here you and I disagree, I think, although maybe you said something that makes me, that shows we're actually aligned. I, unfortunately, for a long time, have been in the camp that believes that Israel is not actually going to deal with the Iranian nuclear threat. I do not believe that the state of Israel has the political will to deal with it conclusively, even if it has the military wherewithal and know-how to do so. There are several reasons for that. The reason that I most recently have been reminded of that viewpoint is actually when I read Prime Minister Netanyahu's autobiography. I don't know whether you read it or not, but there's a point in the autobiography where he settles many scores, which in part is the purpose of an autobiography, right? As Abba Eban once said, an autobiography is a wonderful opportunity for the author to tell the truth about the other guy. So there you have that. But he goes through a set of scores that he wants to settle, and he explains why his decision-making was triumphant and why his decision was correct and proper despite the opposition. But when it came to the Iran deal, the lack of conclusive action against the Iranian nuclear facilities by Israel, he actually places responsibility for at the feet of his chief of staff at the time, at the feet of former heads of Mossad, particularly Meir Dagan. And what that shows me is that the prime minister is basically saying, we haven't dealt with it, and by the way, if we don't deal with it, it's not my fault, it's the fault of my security chiefs. And I just don't think there's the political will to handle this conclusively. With regard to the Democrats and what was taking place during the run-up to the elections in 2016, when there were various Democrats vying for the nomination, including Elizabeth Warren, including Pete Buttigieg, including Bernie Sanders. I'll only say this, and I'll say it directly. Bernie Sanders is a self-loathing Jew, in my opinion. Bernie Sanders, in my opinion, is a Jewish anti-Semite. Bernie Sanders is anti-Zionist. He regularly invokes the fact that he spent some time on a kibbutz in order to justify saying the most outlandish things about the state of Israel. He regularly places himself directly in a manner that is not necessary in league with the Squad, who are a virulently anti-Jewish, anti-Zionist wing of the Democratic Party. I'm not surprised that he was calling for the end of military aid to the state of Israel. Elizabeth Warren, I wouldn't put in that category, but I believe that Elizabeth Warren represents the further leftist camp, not the furthermost, but the further leftist camp of the Democratic Party. And Pete Buttigieg probably got his talking points from somebody who didn't really understand the subject, given that he was a bit of a novice politician. We'll see. I don't know. Depending on how he does as Secretary of Transportation, we'll see whether he's back vying for the nomination for the Democratic Party in a more sophisticated fashion or not. Martin Indyk, I'm sorry, but Martin Indyk is an individual who, at the very least, suffers from a hangover from the peace industry that surrounded the Oslo Accords. I absolutely think that people need to check the source of funding that goes into the institute for which he works, the Brookings Institute. I think that
Council on Foreign Relations.
Pardon me? The council. He's wrote this under the auspices of the Council of Foreign Relations, because Indyk was at the Brookings Institute and he was espousing very, very strong anti-Israel views. And there was a whole question about the funding that he received from, I believe it was actually the Emiratis or the Qataris. I can't remember which one, but people should view askance Martin Indyk's viewpoints. Kurtzer is a different case, and I acknowledge that. But I think that it's to your great credit that you saw that these statements that were anti-Israel were going to permeate throughout the Democratic Party given enough time. Most people did not see that. I did see it. I said so at the time. I think a lot of people who find themselves on the left or center left of the political aisle generally did not want to believe that. And I applaud you for sounding the alarm on that issue. But let me just say, I've said this in previous programs, I've said this in different forums. Here we have a complete agreement. The state of Israel has got to decide urgently what it's going to do with regard to the Israel-Palestinian conflict and its resolution. And it has to decide that, first of all, in its own interests, for its own interests, but also right up there, just behind that priority, is it must make that decision because there is going to come inordinate pressure from its most important strategic ally, the United States of America, to resolve this issue at all costs. My view, here's where we disagree, my view is that's exactly why we have to rubbish and destroy the two-state solution, because it's not practicable or implementable, and it's why we have to bring different solutions to the fore. My solution is the new state solution. We've spoken about that before. Your solution is we must move towards the two-state solution and start taking deliberate steps to bringing that into reality. We've discussed that already during this program and in other programs, but here we have an absolute consensus. Yes, Israel has to decide what it's going to do with regard to the Israel-Palestinian conflict. It is already, in my opinion, acting on borrowed time. How do I know? Because of the statements that you have just repeated, the statements by individuals who are very powerful presences within the Democratic Party, who are openly talking about curtailing US military aid to the state of Israel. But Chuck, let me give you the good news, because I don't believe we're in an existential crisis. The House of Representatives minority leader, Hakeem Jeffries, so this is a major player within the Democratic Party, was in Jerusalem on Monday, and he said that the US must not let the fate of Israel's judicial overhaul, granted he's addressing himself to the controversy surrounding the judicial overhaul and not to the ongoing Israeli-Palestinian conflict, but he said the United States must not let the fate of Israel's judicial overhaul affect military support for Israel. In a conversation with Israeli journalists, Jeffries said, and I'm quoting here, Chuck, the need to make sure that we maintain Israel's qualitative military edge, that it will still be with us regardless of where Israel lands in terms of the judicial reform effort, is paramount. The Democratic Party in the House of Representatives will continue to stand with Israel in lifting up the special relationship between our two countries and in support of Israel's right to exist as a homeland for the Jewish people and as a Jewish democratic state, period, full stop, close quote. So it's not all bad, Chuck. That's also from a big name within the Democratic Party, a current name, far more current, incidentally, than Martin Indyk. And I think that that is sign for hope and optimism. If that's coming from the Democratic Party, we know that support for Israel is rather assured throughout the Republican Party. Maybe we're nowhere near an existential threat to the relationship.
Well, I didn't say that we're in an existential crisis. I said losing the United States would be existential, and we're not at the cliff yet. Okay. And at every moment as you approach the cliff, everything's fine. Until the one moment when all of a sudden it isn't. I don't think we'll get to hit the cliff overnight and in one false step. A relationship as deep as the U.S.-Israeli relationship will probably not be a France 1967. Okay, the U.S. isn't going to turn its back on Israel overnight, and not over 1 or 2 or 3 years. There is a multi-decade process that is underway, and so the names that I gave, you can discount some of them. They're indications of a change in the sense that this never happened before. This was taboo to even raise this kind of a topic. Now, you quoted Mr. Jeffries, a Democratic leader today. You can quote others. You can note the fact that the House has passed things recently, 400 and something to 8, the squad, or to 10 in Israel's favor, and things have gone through the Senate as well, sailed through the Senate. The fundamental relationship is still very, very strong. It's in place. But there's an important saying when you talk about support that's a mile wide and an inch deep. And I'm afraid that's where we're heading. And that inch is eroding. And there are now generations of Americans who've grown up on the narrative, not of heroic and democratic Israel, but a very, very different Israel. And they are certainly in mid-level positions, if not higher in many cases, and they will be in the senior positions in the coming years. And I'm very, very afraid of where we're going, and I don't think we can afford that. I don't think we can allow it to happen, and that in itself is not the reason for making concessions in the West Bank. No. It can't be because of a U.S. position, an international position, but it's certainly a consideration.
I think that you're right to be concerned. I'm concerned. I think that we should actually dedicate a show to what I believe are 2 of the root causes of this. The first is the absolute anti-Israel agenda that is taught and propagated on too many campuses throughout the United States of America, both at the undergraduate and the graduate level. It's extremely problematic at the level of the students and the professors. I'm sure you've encountered this
first-hand experience.
Exactly, and I would very much like us to have that conversation, because the students of today are the policymakers of tomorrow. And in Mayor Pete Buttigieg, you see how that period of time between them being students and becoming policymakers is increasingly truncated and shortened. There's a far more direct path in the age of social media to becoming a policymaker and an influencer than once there was. So that's the first problem. What's being taught on the campuses is extremely problematic. By the way, much of it being funded by our mooted new friends, the Saudis, who are investing millions in American campuses, 20 million to Harvard, 20 million to Georgetown, which is a drop in the well for the Saudis in terms of financial support. And there will be much more of that. And then, in addition to that, you have the agitating of the Democratic Party by, I'm sorry to say it, but I must say it, too many members of the American Jewish community. There are many, many American Jews who, by definition, do not live in the state of Israel, will not live in the state of Israel, have an outsized dedication to bringing about certain developments within the state of Israel without living here. And they are aligned with the Democratic Party. They give very, very often times, not all of them, but many of them, a Taudat Kashrut, the kosher certification, for robust criticism of the state of Israel within the House of Representatives and within the Senate, more in the House of Representatives. That needs to change as well. It's a much bigger topic. We don't have time for it today, but I'd suggest that we deal with that at some program in the future. Last question for you, Chuck. Do you have time to talk about Iran and Hezbollah for a moment, or do you need to go? I know you're under the gun today.
No, I really don't think so. I do have to go
problem.
today, but we will come back to it next time. Just there are worrisome developments in both areas, and we will certainly talk about it.
Great. So we'll take a rain check on that one, and we'll come back to it, as you said, in subsequent programs. Chuck, it's been great. Thank you so much for finding time again, and thank you to our listeners. And I'm actually going to put your article in the show notes so people can read about your article with regard to the normalization deal and its potential contours between Israel and Saudi Arabia. And I'd encourage everybody to take a look at that. And thank you. I really enjoyed the back and forth, Chuck, and I appreciate you putting your points and my count to tee up some of my counterpoints. It's always a pleasure.
Likewise, and we will speak again in 2 weeks.
I look forward to it. Take care, Chuck.
Bye.